July 8, 1945. A German Heinkel. He 111 bomber cuts through the morning fog over the Baltic Sea. But something is wrong. The man at the controls is not German. He's barefoot, starving, shaking, a Soviet POW who should have died months ago. Behind him, 11 prisoners cling to the floor of the aircraft, silent, pale, waiting for the Luftwaffe to blast them out of the sky once they're discovered. Below, a Nazi anti-aircraft battery spots the bomber. They swing their guns upward, and the man flying the Heinkel, a man the guards called the Crazy Russian, pushes the throttles forward. He has stolen a bomber from inside a Nazi death camp. And now, he has minutes to live. They said no one escaped from Peenemünde, not because guards were perfect, not because the fences were impossible, but because men did not survive long enough to even think about escape. The camp was a graveyard with work schedules, a place where prisoners were used until they broke, then replaced by the next convoy of walking corpses. It wasn't built to hold people, it was built to erase them. When Mikhail Devyatayev arrived, he already looked half dead, thin, sick, too weak to carry stones, too stubborn to fall. The guards watched him for one day and gave him a nickname, Der verrückte Russe. The Crazy Russian? Because he didn't bow his head, because he kept standing when others dropped, because he stared at the guards like he wasn't afraid to die. The camp's routine was simple. Wake up, carry stones, build bunkers, watch someone die, repeat. The average prisoner lasted 1 month. Devyatayev had maybe 2 weeks. His body was failing. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. The guards didn't need to kill him. Hunger would do it for them. But the Germans had made a mistake. They didn't know who he was. To them, he was another prisoner with hollow eyes and broken ribs. They never checked his records. If they had, they would have seen this man had flown bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance aircraft. A pilot with thousands of hours. A pilot the Luftwaffe would have gladly executed on the spot. Because to them, Soviet pilots weren't soldiers. They were subhumans with wings. Devyatayev kept his secret. Because in this place, skills didn't save you. They killed you faster. And then he saw it, through the cracks in the barracks wall, through the freezing fog of another morning. A German bomber, a Heinkel 111, gliding above the camp, circling, descending, touching the runway just beyond the fence. The camp wasn't just a prison. It was part of Hitler's V-2 rocket program. The Germans were testing weapons that could hit London in minutes, weapons the Allies didn't even understand yet. And they needed aircraft, lots of them, to transport equipment and personnel. A bomber landing inside a labor camp. It was insane. It was reckless. It was the first real opening the universe had given him. But an opening was not a plan. In this camp, trying to escape meant slow death. The guards didn't shoot escapees instantly. They dragged them out front, hung them from a beam, and made the prisoners finish the workday while the bodies swung above the gate. Devyatayev had seen 3 men die this way in his first week. 2 had tried to dig. 1 had tried to run. None had gotten further than 50 meters. And even if he reached the airfield, even if he somehow crossed the open ground, even if he reached the bomber, he still needed to steal it, fly it, navigate across enemy territory without maps, without instruments, without fuel, and hope Soviet anti-aircraft crews didn't shoot him down on sight. The idea was ridiculous, impossible, delusional, but starving men cling to impossible things. Because impossible is the only thing the guards can't take away. And so Devyatayev watched the Heinkel. Every day it landed. Every day it took off. He memorized routines, guards, the position of the tools, the mechanics who checked the engines. His mind was working again, as a pilot, not as a prisoner. The others in his barracks noticed it first. He wasn't dying anymore. He was planning. And in a place where hope was a death sentence, planning was even worse. "You'll get us all killed," one man whispered. Devyatayev didn't answer, because he knew something they didn't. If he didn't escape soon, he wouldn't live long enough to die trying. Before the camp, before the starvation, before the nickname, the Crazy Russian, Mikhail Devyatayev had been something the Germans would never have believed. A quiet man, a disciplined pilot, someone who followed orders, trusted procedure, and believed that if you did everything right, you survived. War erased all of that. He was only 27 when the Luftwaffe shot him down. It happened fast, too fast for his mind to catch up. One moment, he was climbing through cloud cover on a reconnaissance mission, tracing the outlines of German supply routes. The next, a Messerschmitt Bf 109 dropped behind him, its cannons spitting fire. He felt the impact before he heard it, metal tearing, a wing shuddering, the engine choking, the altimeter spinning downward like a countdown to death. He tried to jump. The canopy jammed. He kicked it open with both legs, ripping the muscles in his side. The world went sideways, then black. When he came to, he was on the ground, blood in his mouth, dirt in his eyes, boots missing. German soldiers were already standing over him, rifles pointed at his head. One of them kicked him lightly, not viciously, just enough to see if he was alive. When he groaned, they laughed. "Soviet pilot," one said. "Worthless prize," another replied. "Berlin wants him anyway." That's when he understood. He wasn't being taken to a camp to work. He was being taken to a camp to disappear. The interrogation was quick and almost casual. He gave his name, rank, unit, nothing more. They didn't beat him. They didn't need to. For the Luftwaffe, a Soviet pilot was already dead. It was just a question of how long they wanted to keep him breathing. He expected a bullet, or a rope, or a shallow grave behind the barracks. Instead, they handed him over to the SS. Men who treated war not as strategy, but as ideology. The SS officer who processed him barely looked at him. "You're a pilot?" "Yes." "Then you're dangerous." A pause. "Put him in the labor unit." That was worse than execution. In the first camp, Devyatayev lasted 2 months, longer than most. He worked until he collapsed, then worked again. Once a guard hit him across the back with a rifle butt for moving too slowly. He didn't feel the pain until hours later. His body had stopped bothering to warn him. One morning, he woke up to find the man sleeping beside him had died during the night. Cold, stiff, eyes open. The guards dragged the body out by the ankles, leaving a dark trail across the floorboards. No one said a word. In camps like this, grief was a luxury. So was anger. So was memory. By the time he was transferred to Peenemünde, the secret rocket testing facility, he no longer looked like a pilot, or even a soldier. He looked like a corpse waiting for confirmation. But something changed in him during the transport. Maybe it was the smell of the sea. Maybe it was the silence of the guards. Maybe it was simply that he was still alive, against every rule of logic. Whatever it was, a thought formed in his mind. Faint at first, then sharper, then undeniable. If they kept moving him, they still needed him for something. If they needed him, he still had options. He didn't know what the plan was, or whether he could move his legs fast enough to outrun anyone. But the idea of giving up, of dying in another nameless pit, no longer felt acceptable. He wanted out, not for glory, not for revenge, just for one simple, brutal reason. Because the war had taken everything else from him, but it had not yet taken his will. When he stepped through the gates of Peenemünde and saw the airfield on the other side of the fence, a real runway, real aircraft, real engines, his mind snapped into place like a weapon being loaded. The guards didn't know what he was capable of. They didn't know he could read wind direction from a single flag. They didn't know he could tell a plane's model from the sound of its engine. They didn't know he could fly a Heinkel. He won 11 better than some of the Germans who piloted them. To them, he was just another starving body. To him, the airfield was the first piece of hope he'd seen in 260 days. But hope alone couldn't save him. He needed something else. Opportunity. And in Peenemünde, opportunity meant waiting for a mistake. A moment. An opening. Something he could turn into a weapon. Peenemünde wasn't a camp. Not in the way people imagine camps. Watchtowers, fences, barking dogs, routine cruelty. No. This place was something worse. It was a factory built on human bones, a testing ground for rockets designed to wipe out cities, A research center that fed on men until their bodies collapsed. Every structure, every guard rotation, every shouted order was designed around one principle. Prisoners were fuel, nothing more. The camp stood between two worlds, the quiet, deadly laboratories of German engineers and the brutal, grinding labor fields where prisoners hauled concrete, metal, and machinery under the whip. The men inside knew it instantly. This was not a place you left, not alive, not ever. The camp didn't need miles of fences, just enough to show you there was no direction worth running toward. North was the Baltic Sea, open water, freezing currents, patrol boats. South was forest, thin, exposed, patrolled by dogs that could outrun any man half-fed. West was the rocket testing range, guards shot anything that moved. East was the runway, flat, open, watched constantly. It was a perfect trap made of geography more than wire. If you ran, you died in minutes. If you hid, you starved in hours. The SS here had a reputation. They weren't brutal because of anger. They weren't sadists who needed an excuse. They were efficient, methodical, predictable in the most terrifying way. A prisoner collapsing from exhaustion meant a 15-second conversation, a nod, and a bullet. No shouting, no ceremony. Just removed from the workforce. The guards didn't enjoy killing. They simply didn't care. A dead prisoner meant one less mouth to feed. Wake before sunrise. Form a line. Count again. March to the work site. Carry loads too heavy for starving bodies. Watch someone fall. Keep walking. At noon, a metal bucket of thin soup, rotten cabbage, sometimes sand, sometimes nothing. Work again. March back. Count the living. Pretend not to see the missing. Sleep on wooden boards. Wake up freezing. Start again. A day in Peenemünde felt like a year. A week felt like a death sentence. The Germans didn't waste time on interrogations. Punishments came in one of three forms. 1. The beam, a horizontal log mounted near the center of the camp. Escape attempts ended here. Public, slow, a warning carved into flesh. 2. The pit A, shallow grave dug behind the barracks, used for men who slowed production, quick, efficient. 3. Reassignment, the worst of all. Tunneling under the launch sites, digging near stored explosives, handling unstable rocket fuel tanks. Men didn't come back from these tasks. The camp wasn't just guarded by rifles. It was guarded by hopelessness. Prisoners were rotated constantly. They weren't placed with familiar faces. They weren't given time to build trust. Everyone was exhausted. Everyone was starving. Everyone was dying at a different speed. The guards didn't need to prevent escape. The environment did it for them. Men didn't plan. Men didn't think. Men survived 1 hour at a time, until they couldn't. For most prisoners, the sight of aircraft only deepened despair, because planes meant distance. Distance meant freedom. Freedom meant something they couldn't even imagine anymore. But for Devyatayev, a pilot who once lived in the sky, the runway was a ghost that followed him everywhere he went. Every engine noise made his hands twitch. Every shadow of a bomber passing overhead made his chest tighten. Every time a German mechanic opened a cowling, inspected a propeller, checked the fuel lines, his mind automatically followed along. Not as a prisoner, as a pilot. He could almost feel the control yoke in his hands again, the vibration of the engines, the familiar climb rate, the banking. Freedom wasn't abstract for him. It had a sound, a shape, a cockpit. All escape plans collapse under one brutal truth. You can't outrun a bullet. You can't swim through freezing seawater. You can't hide on flat land. You can't dig through sand. You can't overpower guards when you weigh 40 kilos. And even if, by some miracle, he reached a bomber, he couldn't start it alone. He couldn't taxi it alone. He couldn't take off alone. He couldn't leave the camp unnoticed. He couldn't navigate home without instruments. He couldn't avoid German fighters. He couldn't convince the Soviets not to shoot him down. Every part of the plan was impossible. Every step led to death. Every path was a dead end. And that's exactly what made him dangerous. Because starving men with nothing to lose don't ask if something is possible. They ask one question: how do I make it possible? The plan didn't come to Devyatayev in a moment of inspiration. It wasn't a flash of brilliance or a desperate impulse. It grew slowly, dangerously, like a spark under wet leaves, almost invisible, but alive. And it began with a single observation, not of a guard, not of a fence, not of a weak spot in the routine, but of a man who didn't belong in a labor camp. One afternoon, as Devyatayev hauled a crate toward the airfield, he noticed something strange. A prisoner, thin, exhausted like the rest, walked toward the bomber with a German mechanic's toolkit. No guard stopped him, no one shouted, no one raised a rifle. The man climbed onto the wing and began checking the fuel line. He worked slowly, carefully, like someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Too exactly. Devyatayev watched him for minutes, pretending to adjust the load on his shoulder. Then it hit him. The Germans had a prisoner working on aircraft maintenance. A prisoner mechanic, a man who touched the planes, who knew the equipment, who walked the airfield without being shot, a man with access. Access Devyatayev needed. He didn't speak to him that day, or the next. Approaching someone too soon was suicide. But he memorized his face, his movements, the slight limp in his left leg, the careful way he handled the tools. In a place where everyone was half dead, this man still moved with purpose. His name was Kazimir Kozanets, a Soviet aircraft technician captured near Minsk. And unlike everyone else in the camp, he still remembered how to think. The first words between them were whispered in darkness, long after roll call, when the barracks were quiet except for coughing and nightmares. "You worked on Heinkels?" Kazimir didn't turn his head. He didn't trust anyone. "I worked on whatever they pointed at," he whispered back. Devyatayev waited. Then Kazimir spoke again, barely audible. "You were watching me." "I was," Devyatayev admitted, "because you saw something I saw." Kazimir hesitated. "The plane?" "Yes." Silence, long, heavy. Kazimir finally exhaled. "You're insane." "Probably." Another pause. "That's why I want to talk to you." Over days, weeks, stolen minutes of whispered conversation, Devyatayev pieced together the one thing the camp guards never expected. A map, not on paper, not in ink, in his mind. A mental model of guard rotations, blind angles, timing between patrols, which gates were real, and which were decoys which guards smoked during shift, when machinery drowned out noise, when the sun blinded watchtower spotters, when the Heinkel crew ate lunch, when the Germans grew careless. Every detail mattered. Starving prisoners didn't plan escapes. The guards had grown comfortable with that fact. Devyatayev was counting on it. The bomber itself was the heart of the plan. Kazimir sketched it slowly with his finger in the dirt behind the barracks, erasing it if footsteps came too close. "What about the engines?" Devyatayev whispered. "They're Merkelins? You've flown worse." "That's not my question." Kazimir looked him dead in the eyes. "They start slow. They warm up loud. You will not go unnoticed." "I know." "You'll need 2 men to spin the props by hand." "I know." "The glass canopy has a sticking point. You'll lose 10 seconds there." "I know." Kazimir leaned closer. "And once you take off, every anti-air crew within 10 miles will try to shoot you down." "Yes," Devyatayev whispered. "I know." The mechanic stared at him. "You're not afraid?" "I'm terrified," he said, "but I don't intend to die here." Kazimir nodded for the first time. "I'll help you." Not everyone could go. Not everyone should go. Devyatayev chose men carefully. Men who could run, men who could push the aircraft into position, men who could spin the propellers, men who wouldn't freeze when rifles were pointed at them, men who understood silence, men who had nothing left to lose. Some prisoners he approached refused instantly, not out of fear, out of exhaustion. "I can't run. My legs won't carry me." "If you fail, they'll kill everyone in this barracks." He didn't argue. He didn't beg. You couldn't build a plan on broken spirits. You had to choose the ones who still had a heartbeat. By the end, he had 11. 11 starving men. 11 walking skeletons. but 11 who still understood one thing. Death was everywhere. But at least this death would mean fighting back. The plan needed one thing above all else: a mistake, a break in routine, a moment where discipline slipped, a second of arrogance from the guards. Most days the Heinkel arrived and departed with German pilots and crew. Impossible to steal. Too many eyes, too many boots. But once every 2 weeks, something happened. The bomber landed with only a skeleton ground crew. No officers, no armed escort, no patrol nearby. Those days the mechanics refueled it lazily, chatted, smoked, argued. Casimir had seen it twice. They needed a third. That third time, that sliver of carelessness, would be their doorway to life or death. Devyatayev spent nights whispering through the barracks, rehearsing every step, every movement, every job, every timing. If one man slowed, the plan collapsed. If one guard spotted them early, the plan collapsed. If the engines refused to start, the plan collapsed. If the runway lights weren't aligned, the plan collapsed. And if the Luftwaffe scrambled fighters, God help them, he accepted all of that, because he had already reached the most important realization. He didn't need the plan to be perfect. He just needed it to be better than dying in the dirt. The Heinkel sliced through the early morning sky, every vibration of the engines telling Mikhail exactly how little time he had. The bomber was fast, faster than anything the Soviets had in this region, but it was still a German aircraft flying over German territory. Sooner or later, someone would notice. He kept the nose low, barely above treetop level, letting the fog swallow them whenever it thickened. His hands trembled violently. Not from fear. Fear had burned out of him days ago, but from starvation, exhaustion, and the aftershocks of violence. His knuckles were split, his nails torn. Every turn of the yoke sent sharp pain through his arms, but he clung to it like a lifeline, because if he let go, they were all dead. Behind him, the prisoners were silent. Not one dared to speak. Each man knew that a single wrong sound, a single moment of panic, could snap the last threads holding this miracle together. Then, voices, muffled at first, growing louder. Mikhail's heart froze. A Luftwaffe control tower was calling them over the bomber's still active radio. He reached toward the dial to shut it off, but stopped. The call sign they were using still matched the base they'd stolen the aircraft from. If he killed the radio abruptly, it would raise suspicion. If he answered, he might not sound German enough to survive more than 10 seconds. Another transmission crackled through the cockpit. Heinkel 111, identify yourself. You're off your assigned vector. Mikhail's breath caught in his throat. He'd flown combat missions before the war, but nothing had prepared him for speaking German to Germans while flying a stolen Nazi bomber out of a death camp. He made his decision. He grabbed a ragged Luftwaffe flight jacket lying on the floor, held it over the microphone, and nudged the push-to-talk switch with his elbow. Then he coughed, hard, violently, dragging the cloth across the mic to distort his voice into static and wind. A burst of garbled sound spilled out, coughing, wheezing, the noise of an engine shuddering. Then he released the switch. Silence. A full second, 2 seconds, 5. The radio crackled again, this time with an irritated but uninterested voice. Heinkel 111, continue. Correct your heading when able. They bought it. A wave of relief washed over him so suddenly his vision blurred. For 2 seconds he let himself breathe. Just 2. Then the rear gunner, one of the prisoners, crawled forward, pale as ash. They're firing, he whispered. Mikhail snapped upright. He looked through the side window. In the distance, tiny flashes, like lightning stuttering across the horizon. AA guns. They weren't shooting at him yet. They were test-firing, calibrating, sweeping sectors of sky. But they were close. He pushed the throttles forward. The engines roared, louder than he should risk. But he needed speed and altitude and a miracle. Fog thinned. Fields stretched beneath them. Every kilometer forward brought them closer to the Soviet lines, but also deeper into German flak zones. The bomber began climbing, slowly, too slowly. The weight of 12 men was dragging performance down, and the Heinkel's engines were already abused from camp maintenance crews who barely kept them flying. The airframe shuddered. A cough from engine number 2, then a sputter. Mikhail's eyes widened. He didn't need to be a German mechanic to understand what that sound meant. The engine wasn't getting fuel consistently. A clogged injector? Water in the line? Corrosion? Any of these could kill them. "Hold on," he whispered, though no one could hear him over the roaring engines. The sputter came again. Longer. The bomber dipped. Men inside grabbed for anything, bolted down. A small scream escaped someone, quickly muffled by a hand. Mikhail slammed the throttle forward, coaxing the dying engine, nursing it with tiny adjustments, feeling the vibrations through the airframe like a doctor listening to a patient's failing heartbeat. The engine hesitated, then caught again, coughing out a cloud of smoke. He kept them level. Barely. But something cold slid into his stomach. They were not going to have enough altitude to outrun flak. Not like this. Not with an engine that might die any second. And then the coastline appeared. Dark, jagged, German-held. Beyond it, water. And beyond that, Soviet territory. The radio crackled again. Another tower. Closer. This one alert. Heinkel 111, approaching sector Bravo 7. Identify immediately. You are entering restricted airspace. Mikhail exhaled once. They knew. Their cover was gone. The next order would be to turn back. Then a scramble of fighters. Then death. He reached up, switched off the radio, and shoved the yoke forward. The Heinkel dove hard into the fog. Behind him, the prisoners clung to whatever they could, some whispering prayers, others wailing silently into their sleeves. AA guns erupted ahead of them, sharp vertical lances of fire. The sky lit up. Tracer rounds streaked upward like burning spears. One thing was suddenly, terrifyingly clear. The Germans finally knew this aircraft wasn't theirs, and they were going to shoot it down over the Baltic Sea. The first flak burst hit so close it rattled the cockpit glass. Shrapnel sang past the windows in a high metallic hiss. The entire bomber lurched sideways, one wing dropping from the shockwave. Someone in the back screamed. Another man started sobbing. Mikhail didn't turn around. If he did, the fear in their eyes might break him. He leveled the aircraft with both hands, muscles trembling, teeth clenched so hard his jaw ached. Another burst, closer. A black flower of fire bloomed just beneath the left engine. Heat washed through the cockpit like an open furnace door. Mikhail forced the bomber lower, insanely low, just meters above the water. Salt spray streaked the glass. If they dipped even a little too far, the sea would swallow them whole. But lower meant fewer guns could track them. Tracer rounds slashed across the sky just behind the tail. A heartbeat slower, and they all would have been vaporized. "Hold on!" he yelled, though his voice was swallowed by the engines. The next patch of flak erupted ahead, an entire curtain of explosions that turned the sky into a solid wall of black smoke and fire. He had two choices: climb into it or fly straight into the sea. Instead, he chose a third option, a suicidal one. He rolled the bomber. The Heinkel groaned violently, metal bending under stress it was never meant to endure. Prisoners tumbled across the floor, slamming into bulkheads. But the maneuver worked. They sliced through a gap no sane pilot would dare attempt. But sanity wasn't part of survival anymore. More flak burst behind them, then another wave ahead, an entire battery now fully convinced they were under air attack. Rounds detonated in a perfect murderous rhythm, trying to guess where the bomber would appear next. Mikhail yanked the controls, weaving the aircraft between bursts, diving, skimming the sea, pulling up only when the wingtips nearly kissed the water. Every movement tore at his starved, battered body. Sweat blinded him. His arms cramped. His breath came in ragged gasps. But he kept flying. He would keep flying until the aircraft fell apart or the sea took them. A burst erupted to their right, so close the shockwave punched through the fuselage, showering the cockpit with fragments of insulation. A pipe overhead burst, spraying cold air and dust. Behind him, one of the prisoners shouted, "They hit something! There's smoke!" Mikhail didn't need to look. He could smell it. The engine that had been failing earlier was coughing out thick black exhaust now. Its temperature gauge twitched upward in manic little jumps. He had minutes, maybe less. He scanned ahead through the fog, desperate for any sign of coastline, woods, cliffs, anything that wasn't water and gunfire. Then he saw it. A faint, distant smudge of land emerging through the haze. Not German trenches, not flak towers, not patrol boats. A coastline he recognized from before he was captured. Soviet territory. He felt something break loose in his chest. A sob? A gasp? He didn't know. He didn't care. He pushed the throttles forward, both of them, even though one engine was howling in protest. The bomber surged. The flak behind them faded. The tracers thinned, then vanished. The last gun stopped firing, unable to reach them anymore. For the first time since takeoff, the only sounds were the engines, the wind, and the ragged breathing of the men whose lives hung on every second of this impossible escape. Then a new sound cut through the cockpit. A hollow clunk, a grinding metallic squeal. Engine 2. The dying engine seized, coughed, and locked. The entire aircraft jerked as if punched from the side. The propeller windmilled, then froze. Smoke poured from the cowling, trailing behind them in a long black ribbon. The bomber began to sink, not fall, but sag, like something wounded and exhausted after too long a fight. Mikhail leaned forward, forehead nearly touching the controls. "Not yet," he whispered. "Just a little more. Please, just a little more." He coaxed the remaining engine gently, nursing it, begging it, giving it micro-adjustments like a surgeon closing an artery. The coastline grew larger, clearer. Trees, fields, and his heart stopped. Gunfire, but not German. Soviet positions, firing at him. To them, he wasn't a hero. He wasn't a prisoner. He wasn't a man who clawed his way out of a Nazi death camp. He was a German bomber flying directly toward their lines. They were going to shoot him down. The Soviet anti-aircraft crews had no idea who was flying that bomber. All they saw was the black cross on the wings, the silhouette they'd memorized in blood and fire. To them, it was the enemy, coming straight at their lines. Tracer fire stitched the air below him, at first wildly, then increasingly accurate. The Soviet gunners were good. Too good. Rounds cracked past the cockpit, ripping the fog in glowing orange streaks. One bullet tore through the wing root. Another shattered a panel behind Mikhail's seat. Glass fragments peppered his shoulders. He didn't feel the cuts until seconds later. He rocked the bomber left, then right, waving the wings violently, every pilot's desperate signal. Don't shoot. Friendly, surrendering, anything, just don't shoot. But they did, not because they were cruel, but because they had no reason to imagine a Soviet pilot could be inside a German bomber stolen from a death camp. The second engine temperature spiked. The aircraft began to sink faster now, not a controlled descent, but a dying animal losing altitude with every heartbeat. The tree line rushed toward them. Mikhail wrestled the controls, trying to keep the bomber level, trying to find even a patch of ground, a clearing, a field, anything that wasn't forest or swamp. Then he saw it, a narrow strip of marshy land between the trees. Barely 20 meters wide, too short for landing, too soft for wheels. The Heinkel screamed as it dropped toward the earth. Inside, the prisoners braced, hands locked around anything they could grab, some screaming prayers, others too exhausted even for fear. The left wing clipped the top of a birch tree. The impact spun the bomber sideways. The fuselage slammed into the ground with a deafening crunch, metal folding like paper, the tail ripped off. Debris flew like shrapnel. Instruments burst from their mounts. Mikhail's head hit the control panel. The world flashed white, then black. He woke to silence, a wet, cold silence. There was mud in his mouth, on his face, in his hair. He was lying half submerged in a marsh, still strapped to the broken pilot's seat. Half the cockpit was gone. The front glass shattered outward. The bomber lay in two twisted sections across the clearing, smoke curling from the torn metal. He tried to move and gasped. His ribs stabbed him like knives. His right arm wouldn't lift. But he was alive. Behind him, groans and coughing. The prisoners, miraculously, were alive too. Beaten, bleeding, but breathing. Boots crashed through the brush. Soviet soldiers, rifles raised, hard faces, ones that had seen too many tricks, too many traps. "Hands up!" one shouted. Mikhail tried to lift his only working arm. The soldiers yanked him out of the wreck, dragging him through the mud, shouting over one another, trying to understand. "Why are you flying a German bomber? Where did you get this aircraft? Are there more coming? Are you a spy? A collaborator?" They didn't wait for answers. Within minutes he was bound, shoved against a tree, and interrogated on the spot, bleeding, half-conscious, barely able to speak. He told them the truth. He told them everything. They didn't believe a word. Who would? A starving man in a German uniform taken from the cockpit of a Nazi bomber, claiming he stole it from a concentration camp and escaped with a dozen prisoners. It sounded like madness. He was thrown onto a transport truck, still dripping swamp water, and taken to headquarters. There the questions continued, then the accusations, then the beatings. To the officers of Smersh, it was simple math. No Soviet pilot could escape a death camp, steal a bomber, and fly it home. Impossible. Therefore, he must be lying. Therefore, he must be a traitor. For weeks he sat in a cell, bones healing crooked, starvation returning, interrogators rotating in shifts, trying to break him. They didn't need him to confess. They needed him to fit their paperwork. And through all of it, not one investigator even bothered to check the wreck of the Heinkel sitting in that marsh. Not one bothered to question the surviving POWs until much later. Not one bothered to ask the Germans. Truth didn't matter yet. He was sent to a penal battalion, a place where men survived minutes, sometimes hours, but rarely days. He wasn't given a trial. He wasn't given a defense. He was told only this: win back your honor with blood. And so he fought, and somehow, against every rule of nature, he lived. He lived long enough for the truth to surface, long enough for the surviving prisoners to testify, long enough for captured German officers to confirm the escape. But the full truth wouldn't be acknowledged for decades, because the Soviet Union wasn't ready to admit that one starving pilot had done something no operation, no unit, no spy network had achieved. He stole a bomber out of the heart of a Nazi camp and used it to save 11 men. Years passed before he was formally rehabilitated, decades before he was honored, a lifetime before he was believed, and when the world finally learned his name, he wasn't the mad Russian the guards had mocked. He was the man who pulled off one of the most impossible escapes in the history of war. Mikhail Devyatayev died in 2002, quietly, without spectacle, surrounded by family. The sky that nearly killed him so many times finally let him go. But his story remains, not because it's miraculous, not because it's dramatic, not even because it's heroic. It remains because it proves something terrifyingly simple. Even in the darkest machinery of war, even inside cages built to break the human spirit, even when the world calls you a traitor, a madman, a fool, a single starving man can still steal a bomber and rewrite the impossible.